anything. I've been designated as the moderator for this evening, mostly because I insisted on it. Tonight's topic is as old as humankind and as fresh as today's news. As we know, the Supreme Court at this time is wrestling with the question of whether a baker is within his rights to refuse to provide a wedding cake for the marriage of a same-sex couple because that marriage violates his religious beliefs. Not long ago, the court decided the Hobby Lobby case, in which they ruled that a privately owned company, which Hobby Lobby is, does not have to provide in their insurance program birth control coverage if that violates their personal religious beliefs. And here, near home by a long shot, there's a pending case in Acton over the question of whether taxpayer money, community preservation money, can be used legally to help houses of worship maintain their historic buildings. And institutions like ours. So this continues to be, as it has always been, a vexing topic. Now, here's the plan for the evening. To set the stage, Sam Dorn, our town historian, is going to either remind or inform us, as the case may be, in a brief period of time, our own history here in Lexington and the history of this parish and its relationship to the town, to the civic government of this community. 1692 to 1833, this was the only parish in town. And that's a different story, although echoes the Virginia story, which we will be finding out more about because our two guests tonight played a prominent role in that story. Then I'll introduce two ex-presidents, and they will talk together about this whole issue and how they see it and how the roles that they've played in it. Then they will welcome your comments, your questions, your thoughts, and there's a mic there on the sanctuary floor. Afterwards, they have agreed to stay for a bit. If anybody has any particular questions or conversation that they want to continue to have with General Washington and Mr. Madison. So, housekeeping. At the continuing request of the Lexington Fire Chief, just want to remind you about exits. That's one out the main door of the church. There's a side door of the church which you can reach going through that exit there, and then the back door which you can reach through either exit. Okay, so Sam Dorn, born and brought up in town, a fellow townsman. His interest in Lexington history goes back to his days as a very small boy, when Larry Whipple used to visit at the house, Guy and Lorraine Dorn, and he became enthralled by this. He's now a newsman covering Beacon Hill and the goings on Beacon Hill, but he continues to maintain a deep interest in Lexington history, and I know that whenever I've had a question, Sam always has the answer, or he knows where to get it. Helen Cohen and some of us guided and helped a lot by Sam and Charles Goodell, did a LexMedia show on the history of First Parish, and Sam was crucial in that. So he's sitting away back there somewhere. Oh, here he is. Sam Dorn.
Thank you, Dan. Good evening, and welcome to the First Parish Church here in Lexington, where here in Lexington our municipal government was established, as I noted in a talk last week, for the first and foremost purpose of being a parish with a church, hiring a minister, building a meeting house. Those were the first goals of this municipal government here. We hired the minister, built his house down where the Carey building is, and so forth. And the meeting house doubled as both the town hall and the church, in effect. Now, just as religion was the motivation for establishing our municipal government here in town, so too it was the motivating factor for colonizing Massachusetts here. So when the Mayflower came along in 1620, those first settlers of what was to become Massachusetts were bringing the concept of religion as we know it today in America. They were separatists who wanted to sever all ties with the Church of England and sought what they felt was a more traditional form of worship compared with an Anglican church still heavily steeped in Catholic traditions. So a second colony then, the fledgling Massachusetts Bay Colony, was established first up in Salem and bolstered in 1630 by the arrival of a boatload of Puritans on the Arbella. Now those passengers included their new governor, John Winthrop, and the Puritans believed it was possible yet to purify the Church of England, in part by returning it to a more simple form of worship. Now, religion carried great weight in those colonial days in Massachusetts, and religious leaders could wield great power. It was the Reverend Increase Mather, who minister of the Second Church in Boston, who represented the Massachusetts Bay before the King in London when the colony of Massachusetts Bay sought to restore its charter. Now, while separatists and Puritans had traversed the Atlantic in search of a safe place in which to practice their religion, they were not in the business, per se, of equal protection. Two Quaker women came to Boston in 1656, spreading the Friends' philosophy. They were jailed and their books were burned. Two other women, Mary Dyer and Anne Hutchinson, still sit on the State House lawn today, cast in bronze. Dyer was hanged, likely on Boston Common, as a result of her Quaker beliefs. Hutchinson banished to Rhode Island and excommunicated after she held theological meetings and voiced criticism of local ministers' teachings. Centuries later, incidentally, Governor Michael Dukakis issued a posthumous pardon for Hutchinson.
Did a lot of good.
Under colonial law in Massachusetts Bay, the death penalty awaited any Jesuit priest who sought to preach Catholicism to the colonists. Massachusetts' harsh anti-Catholic stance relaxed, according to the Boston Archdiocese, after a Catholic nation, France, helped deliver America to independence from Great Britain. The 1780 Massachusetts Constitution paved the way for greater religious tolerance. Article 2 guaranteed, quote, "No subject shall be hurt, molested, or restrained in his person, liberty, or estate," end quote, for his or her religious beliefs or worship practice. In 1788, Boston Catholics celebrated their first public mass. The stereotypical Massachusetts village has a town common at its core, of course, originally public grazing land or haying land. Church can usually be found right on the common, so prominently placed that its name clearly ought to be First Parish Church or something like that. Those original churches, self-governing congregations, congregational churches at first, for generations preached that Calvinist religion of the original English immigrants. By the early 19th century, many of these town churches flipped to Unitarian Christianity. And then a constitutional amendment in, as Dan noted, the notable year, 1833, the 11th Amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution, disestablished our church-state relationship here in the Commonwealth. The Bay State, with its Puritan and Pilgrim roots, had been entrenched, the last of the 13 original states to disestablish the church-state relationship. And Congregationalism, long the religion of Massachusetts, was dwindling. In the generation leading up to 1833, the presence of Congregationalists had shrunk by around 30%, according to historian Peter Field. Now, they were replaced by the likes of Baptists, Methodists, Universalists, who were separate from the Unitarians until the last century. And with the 11th Amendment passed, their new churches sprang up and sought their due status. Such as here in Lexington, for example, where a new Baptist church wanted a stake in the town's ministerial fund, and they were granted it since local government could not funnel public money any longer to a single church. Anyway, so much for church and state in Lexington and Massachusetts, and look forward to hearing from our distinguished presidents who are in the building tonight. So thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you, Sam. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the man who is first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, the man who brought us victory in our revolution against the tyranny of the British Crown and the British Parliament, the first president of these United States, General George Washington of Virginia.
Thank you kindly, sir.
In company with a public servant who won his first elective battle at age 26, the father of our Constitution and of our Bill of Rights, the author was John Jay and Alexander Hamilton of the Federalist Papers, the fourth President of the United States, the Honorable James Madison, also of Virginia. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you kindly, sir, for your gracious introduction. I must tell you, it is with mixed emotions that I am back here in the shadow of the Lexington Commons. I would also suggest that my last visit here was in late autumn of 1789, and this particular visit to this vicinage may be the most remarkable unrecorded event in my personal history. But it is indeed an honor to be here. You know, I told you I have had mixed emotions. I don't need to tell any of you what happened just a few yards away. I would suggest to you that when I visited this place in the early years of my presidency, well, let me digress for just a moment. You know, at my age, at my stage, I'm allowed to do that. You do understand. Anybody here that has white hair understands completely about digression. Sir, may I ask you, no time for a shave? I'm sure we can arrange a cold water razor for you. Well, actually, I see that everything has changed, has it not, Mr. Madison? The ladies are wearing pantaloons.
They take comfort to an extraordinary degree.
It is true. And of course, we both believe in dressing for comfort, but some of you overwhelm us, I will tell you. But I digressed. You know, I made a promise when I was elected to the presidency that I would visit every state that had ratified the Constitution. So in my first year in the presidency, I headed to the northward. And I did indeed visit every single state in the north, save for one. Do you know which state I did not visit? Madam, be courageous, say it louder. Rhode Island, or it was sometimes referred to as Rogue Island back then, because they had not ratified the Constitution at the time that I made my visit. And so I had arrived on the trip in Boston town, and I was intending to come to this vicinage on October 26th. I was going to spend an entire day here, and I awoke that morning and I had developed an infection, a cold in my left eye. I was in great pain. I could not focus. The weather was incredibly inclement, and so I canceled my visit here to Lexington. And I recovered, I repaired, and on the 29th of October, I made my way to the northern shore of Massachusetts area, and then across to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I spent 4 days in that vicinage. But on my way back down to Boston, I did pass through here. I actually passed through Andover originally, where I enjoyed a breakfast, made my way through, how do you pronounce it, Billerica?
Billerica.
Billerica. I was told that it does not pronounce the way I've seen it written on maps. And then, of course, I arrived here in the afternoon, and my first visit was, without question, to the Commons. And there was a small assemblage of notables there, and it was my chance to convey to them my recollection of what I had heard, not being here at that time, of course, and the fact that this was the place where the British first spilled American blood. I also recounted for the confabulation there that day a story that Dr. Franklin had shared with me of blessed memory. Dr. Franklin had told me that he had been confronted by several Brits and told that we Americans had ill-used the British heavily here at Lexington. We had the audacity to open fire while kneeling behind stone walls. Franklin told me that he told the British, "It is my understanding, gentlemen, that a stone wall has two sides. You can fire back from the other side, be that as it may." I thought, with your grace and understanding, before we get a little bit more in depth in the subject of the issue of church and state, that I might share with you as quickly as I can a little bit about how we got to the point where we had that ability to have that decision. How did we get to the Constitution? Now, we do not have the entirety of the rest of this calendar month, so I will try to do this as quickly as possible. Because I must tell you, and Mr. Madison will tell you in his own way, our lives were intrinsically interwoven with the story of the formation of this nation, how we got to the Constitution, how indeed we got to the Bill of Rights, that First Amendment, allowing for no establishment of a state religion and the free practice of religion. We were happy, loyal British subjects. We had all the rights, we had all the privileges, we had all the franchises of Englishmen here in what we call British America, at least the ones that were important to us. And the most important thing of all, our lordly masters pretty much left us alone for nigh on 150 years, going back to the 1600s. I called it salutary neglect. What did that mean? It means that we governed ourselves by and large here in British America. It means we adjudicated our own cases in our own courtrooms. It means that we raised our own money when we needed money. This would come to bite the King of England on the back of his neck. And that's the story I want to try to tell you as quickly as I can. I, of course, served the King. I served as an officer in the Virginia Colonial Regiment. I went in at 1 and 20 as Major George Washington. Have any of you served in the military? Goodly number. Any of you officers by any chance? May I ask your ranks? Captain? Lieutenant Colonel?
Well, just one officer, junior grade, to tell you the truth.
I beg your pardon?
Well, I don't blame him. One officer, junior grade I was, but that's an officer, sort of.
All right. Well, let me suggest to you that I went in as a major at 1 and 20, and how does someone become a major in the military when they had been a civilian? And the answer is I purchased my rank. That is the way it was done in Great Britain. It's the way it was done in Europe. I ended that practice in the American military, which is why the lieutenant colonel, forgive me, we call lieutenant colonels colonel, which is why the colonel had to work for his rank, and pretty much all of you who had served as officers. But believe me, if I had more money, I would have purchased a higher rank, but I did not. So I enter the military at a time when sabers were rattling betwixt Great Britain and her hereditary enemy, which was what country? Always at war with Great Britain. Short, small periods of peace. And this time it was shaping up to be a war of empire. This would be a war that would ultimately be fought for 7 years. It would be fought as far away as the Philippines and in India. It would be fought in Africa. It would be fought in Europe. And it would be fought most extensively in North America. That portion of the 7 Years' War was widely known as what? French and Indian War, but as Virginians we refer to it as the French War. I fight in that war for king and country, but I begin to notice something, and it is germane to the topic that we are covering tonight, because we are talking about rights. We are talking about freedoms. We are talking about liberties. What I noticed during my period as an officer in the Virginia Colonial Regiment, and I had been promoted by merit to lieutenant colonel and then colonel, commander-in-chief of all the forces of Virginia, I noticed that our lordly masters over in Great Britain and their military aristocracy looked down on us. We were lowly Americans, backwater provincials. We were colonials. My soldiers from Virginia were not paid the same as British regular soldiers. Indeed, I was not paid the same. My orders as a colonel, and if you don't understand military ranking, that's a high rank. It's just below brigadier general. My orders as a colonel could be countermanded or negated completely by a lieutenant or a captain in the British regular army. This was very problematic. As a matter of fact, if you'll allow me one more digression, this became so problematic for myself that I felt compelled to travel to Boston town for the very first time in my life. Hence the digression, the vicinage of this area. I was weeks before my 24th birthday, and I did indeed travel to Boston town. I needed to see Governor William Shirley. He was the Royal Governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was also the Royal Governor of Military Affairs here in North America. By the by, on my visit and trip, 600-mile journey up to Boston town, exactly halfway on that journey sat the greatest city in colonial America, the second greatest city in the entirety of the British Empire, second only to London town. And of course, after July 2nd, it became the greatest city in America. Please tell me you know what city I speak of. You are bright as fresh paint. Philadelphia City. I did get some looks of consternation, however, when I said after July 2nd. I do hope that you know the question of our independency from Great Britain was voted upon on July 2nd, 1776. It was adopted, which was a formality, on the 4th of July and read to the public on July 8th. Mr. John Adams, a fellow man from Massachusetts, he said, July 2nd will long be remembered in this country with great illuminations and great celebrations. Mr. Adams was only off by 2 days. That actually characterizes a great deal of Mr. Adams' situation, does it not? That's a story for another day. In any event, I stopped in Philadelphia. It was overwhelming. There were 4,000 or 5,000 homes all atop each other, merchant shops, houses of worship of every denomination, 17 different languages being spoken, the rush of commerce down the middle of High Street, what you all call today the Market Street, the rush of pedestrians, chicken, hogs, cattle, geese. The air in Philadelphia was very ripe. Actually, it still is, if truth be told. But it was overwhelming. I did ultimately make my way up to meet Governor Shirley in Boston town. I left hat in hand with my tail between my legs. My problems and the problems of the Virginia Regiment did not go away. Our lordly masters continued to lord over us. We were ultimately successful. We push the French out of virtually all of North America. We take Fort Duquesne, which is where the three rivers met, the Ohio, the Allegheny, the Monongahela. We renamed Fort Duquesne. Anybody know what we named it? Fort Pitt, madam. There is a town growing around it. It's called Pittsboro, if that's what you're referring to. You are absolutely correct. And I resigned my commission at that time, and I returned back to Mount Vernon. My friends will tell you that my resignation had nothing to do with the questions of my authority or the pay disputes. My friends will tell you that I resigned my commission for a very different reason, for a lady, and perhaps they were right. I was engaged to be wed to the widow of Colonel Daniel Custis, Martha Dandridge Custis, and indeed on 12th night, 1759, she became Mrs. George Washington. What a night that was. We burned more candles than most people do in a year. It was absolutely remarkable. We spend the next 15, 16 years together at Mount Vernon. She calls those the golden years. But everything is changing, and this is the crux of the story. We are speaking here about liberties and about freedoms. A few years after my marriage had absolutely nothing to do with this, but the King of England, George III, goes to his counting room and he almost falls over with apoplexy because Great Britain is nigh on bankrupt. And he tells his ministers, do something about this. And his ministers put their heads together and they come back to the king and they say, Your Majesty, we just finished fighting a very expensive war against the French. Most of the cost of that war was incurred in British America. Let us, Your Majesty, turn to the American colonials, and we shall refill the treasury of Great Britain. I tell you this because it's critical to your understanding of your history that you are clear about the fact that the French and Indian War and the cost thereof was directly causative of the War of American Independency, and it had pretty much everything to do with money. For the next 11 years, the Crown, the ministers of the King, and many, not all, but many of the members of Parliament systematically strip us of our freedoms. They usurp our liberties, and they reach in to our pockets and into our purses in ways that they had never done before. I want to tell you this as quickly as I can so that we can get to the matters at hand. We are hit out of the blue with the Sugar Act and the Currency Act. This upsets many American colonials. Committees of correspondence begin to form betwixt the various colonies. We have a common insult and injury. This is the same year, 1764, that one of your countrymen, Mr. James Otis, do you know the name? stands up at a session of the Massachusetts Bay Colonial Legislature and shouts, in a very ungentlemanly way, I might add, "Gentlemen, taxation without representation is tyranny," which became a rallying cry in the early days of our cause. But truth be told, if we had been given representation in Parliament, we would have been a small voting voice, easily brushed aside, and our problems would not have gone away. The real problems were the iron fist which the King and his ministers in the Parliament used to achieve their objectives, and what many of us here in British America saw as the absolute arrogance of an island nation trying to control a continent. It continues. There's the Quartering Act. You return to your home, there are 2 foreign soldiers. They want to reside in your home. Some of them are gentlemen, most of them pretty rough stuff. They're also eating your food. Also, they're not paid much for their soldierly duties. So when they're not working as soldiers, they take on secondary occupations. They might become longshoremen in the port of Boston, for example. Problem is, they have taken your work. They've taken your husband's work, your brother's, your uncle's work. You're not happy. Then we, of course, are hit with the infamous Stamp Act. You remember the Stamp Act from your schooling days. How many of you are involved in business in any way, shape, or form? Just a show of hands. 2 pence for every single piece of paper that you use in your business. You never had to pay that before. Are any of you officers of the court, attorneys, barristers, solicitors that you would admit to? 4 pence for every single piece of paper used in your law practice. You know he will pass that on to you, and lawyers can generate a lot of paperwork. You do understand that. I want to see if I can get a little bit more participation. How many of you have a diploma of any type? Ladies, put your hands down. Madam, it's not just the fashion that has changed. I am humbled. I am pleased, actually. Everyone included. How many of you have a diploma of any type? £2. You never had to pay that before. You never had to pay that before. Sir, you enjoy reading the newspaper? I'm sorry, it's taxed. My apologies. The wilderness man, we know he cannot read. But he enjoys having the news read to him at a tavern while he's playing cards. His playing cards are taxed. And madam, your secret will out. I know that you like to play dice. Your dice are taxed. The Stamp Act contains 119 paragraphs of taxes. And we do the only thing that we can do. We stop buying British-made goods. We hit the merchants of England, particularly London, in their purses. They complain to the members of Parliament, who talk to the ministers, who talk to the King. And the King tears up the Stamp Act. It looks as though our resistance is working. But the very same day that the King tears up the Stamp Act, he signs into law the Declaratory Act. I will lay wage almost none of you have ever heard of that. It's important in your history. The Declaratory Act states that in all cases whatsoever, the King, and I'm paraphrasing, the King can enact legislation over his colonial subjects and tax his colonial subjects. In other words, just because we are tearing up the Stamp Act today, do not think that we will not do to you what we want to do when we want to do it. Forgive me. Did that not sound like an angry, abusive father yelling at a child? This is the way the King wanted us to feel. The King thought that he would say, hush, and like a dutiful child, we would go stand in a corner. I have one question for you. Did we British Americans go stand in a corner? We did not. We did not. There is armed conflict that follows. In New York City, and a very serious event in Boston town. 5 Bostonians killed, 6 wounded. You know about this. The first to die, a free African named Crispus Attucks. He became the first martyr in the American cause of independency. We are then hit, and some of these things are happening with overlapping dates. You need to understand that. But we are then hit with the Townsend Acts. The Townsend Acts taxes paper, paint, glass, lead, and something that we enjoy drinking a great deal. Tea, which is very inexpensive. It is all but free. It is ubiquitous, and we shop for it competitively. We stop buying British-made goods. The Townsend Acts get torn up. But the King keeps in force, in fact, he strengthens the Tea Act. And as you well know, there are tea events all up and down the eastern seaboard. Marylanders burn a tea tax collection ship down to the waterline. Philadelphia, a captain comes very close to being tarred and feathered. But in Boston town, I think some of you are about to be surprised at my particular belief with regard to this incident. In Boston town, 50 or 60 ruffians, and they were ruffians. They did not have the courage to even come out in public in their own persona. They come out under cover of darkness, dressed as Indians. They board 3 ships in the Boston harbor, and they tossed 400 chests of tea into the water that night. There were other ways to accomplish that. That's the perspective of this one Virginian. The king was not amused. The king handed down a series of punishment laws, punitive legislation called the Coercive Acts. Of course, we began to call them by a different name, which I'm sure you know. The Intolerable Acts, and they were intolerable. The port of Boston shut down with the stroke of a pen. This is how Bostonians made their livings. You want to go hunting on your own game land? Sir, you want to go hunting, do you understand what I'm asking him? On his own game land, he needs to buy a tax stamp. The king brings the border of Canada down into New York overnight with the stroke of a pen. He's not having problems with the Canadians. And there are other acts as well. This is too much for us to take. We agree that we will come together in Philadelphia City in the Carpenters Guild Hall in September of 1774. I was a Virginia delegate. We make our way to Philadelphia. We pass townsmen and farmers. Some of them remove their covers and cheer us on. Others, they stay covered and they're scowling at us. Why scowling? This is also important to your understanding of your history. How we got to these rights and liberties. It's important that you remember that 1/3 of British Americans were sons and daughters of liberty. 1/3 were loyal to the king and crown. And 1/3, they were right in the middle. They didn't know where they stood. And those percentums held throughout the entirety of the War of American Independence. It made it very difficult to prosecute the war. We come together in Philadelphia. We are citizens. Well, let me ask you. Georgia doesn't send anyone, but they send a strong letter of support. So I include them in the number. I want you to answer quickly without thought. We are citizens of 13 separate what? Thank you. I'm a general. I enjoy when you fall into my trap. But you're right. That was our legal status. But you need to change the way you think about your history. We were citizens of 13 separate countries. Our country was Virginia. Your country, Massachusetts Bay. We were meeting in the country of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvanians would spend their whole lives in their country. They would never step foot in the country of Maryland, or the country of Delaware, or the country of the Jerseys, or the country of New York, let alone the Ohio wilderness country. We were absolute strangers to each other. 13 economies, 13 currencies, 13 armies. At the time of that first Congress, excuse me for digressing, you do call it the First Continental Congress, do you not? We didn't call it that. We didn't know there was going to be a second one. We called it the Philadelphia Congress or the General Congress. But at the time of that first Congress, Connecticut was at war with Pennsylvania and Virginia. 9 of the colonies had standing navies. We had all manner of different customs. For example, Massachusetts. I walk in. I'm a colonel from Virginia. A fellow by the name of John Adams, Mr. Adams of Massachusetts Bay, approaches me with his hand out. Well, it was more like this, actually. But he approaches me, and he says, "Colonel Washington, what an honor to meet you, sir." I look at his hand. I consider that rather aggressive. I take a slight step back. He, being a New Englander, closes the distance with his hand out. I take another half step back. Do you understand? Different countries, different customs. In our day, gentlemen from Maryland southward, bow. From Pennsylvania northward, they proffer hands. In Pennsylvania, which was a Quaker colony, women proffered their hands, and that was upsetting in the extreme, I will tell you. We don't accomplish very much. Our agendas are so very, very different. We have some simple non-importation agreements. But what really happened at that first Congress is that we came together as Americans for the very first time. Still stirred by the words of another Virginian, Mr. Patrick Henry, who had said a month or so earlier, "I am not a Virginian. but an American. An American. We agreed that we would come back together again 1 year later. It does not take a year. We are back 6 months later as a result of the events that occurred outside this door. April 19th, 1775. On the heels of the alarm riders, British troops march on those two towns, Lexington, your neighbor, Concord, and they are going to arrest patriots, confiscate black powder and weaponry. And they are met by Minutemen, armed American resistance. The War of Independence has begun. Congress comes back in session with a very full agenda. First order of business, we agree to raise up arms against our king, something that no colony in the history of humankind had ever done successfully. And we were going to do it against the most powerful fighting force on earth, British Army, British Navy. Second order of business, we send a petition to the king, the Olive Branch petition. In it we say, Your Majesty, we want to continue to be your loyal subjects in perpetuity forever. But we have governed ourselves, and we've tried our own cases, and we've raised our own money, and let us continue to do that. And by the by, we do want representation in Parliament. We get the king's answer back, but you need to understand that we live in a 4-mile-an-hour world, so it takes a little bit of time. We send it to the king in May of 1775. The following August, the king's answer comes back to us. It is as clear as the sun in the meridian sky. You are in rebellion. He wouldn't be smiling, because he lets you know that he will stop at nothing to bring you to justice. Third order of business, I was appointed unanimously as the Commander-in-Chief of the new Continental Army of the United Colonies of America. I was scared to death. I had led a regiment. I had never led an army. I stood up. My knees were shaking. I heard my own voice cracking. I could not even walk to the dais. I said, Gentlemen, I am not worthy of the honor that you have bestowed upon me. I lack the military experience, and I lack the ability to succeed. And then, as if raised by the hand of a divine providence, I squared my shoulders and I said, But I shall serve our glorious cause for no pay and for no profit. I sat down, you could hear a pin hit the floor. Everyone in that room knew that our world, perhaps the world, would never be the same again. You know how the story ends. We as a people raised up these United States of America. We cast off the yoke of tyranny. And now we were a country, and we had to decide what kind of country we were going to be. And make no mistake about that, because there were a wide range of options and opinions, including those ill-conceived who wanted to make me what? King. I pushed back in the strongest of terms. You know, when I was commissioned that June of 1775, I wrote to Mrs. Washington. I sent her a copy of my will, and I told her I'd be home for Christmas Eve. I didn't tell her which Christmas Eve. I literally walked across the threshold of our home at Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve, 8.5 years later. And so I pushed back at this suggestion, telling people I did not just fight a war for 8.5 years against King George III of England so that I might become King George I of America. But again, important to your understanding of your history, important to your understanding of why liberties and freedoms were so important to us. The rest of the world, at the time that we declare our independence from Great Britain, I always call that the promise. And then again, at the time that we sign our Constitution, I always call that the delivery upon this promise. The rest of the world is under the control of men and women of absolute power. America is the only country on earth that is not. Every other nation on the planet kings, queens, lords, ladies, sheiks, viziers, caliphs, potentates, maharajas, mikados, emperors, even a tsarina. I ran out of fingers. We alone, for the first time in human history, raised up a nation based on ideas. The ideas constrained in our laws, the Constitution of the United States of America. Enshrined in the First Amendment is the right to religious freedom. It is amended to the Constitution of the United States. The right for you to practice whatever religion you so choose. I have written personally that I care not whether a man is a Mohammedan, a Jew, a Christian of any sect, or has no religion whatsoever. That is enshrined in our Constitution. With your grace and understanding, before we open up this confabulation to your comments and questions, I would at this time like to ask the most illuminated mind in all of United America to speak more specifically on the subject of matters of church and state, because if truth be told, I have my own feelings about it. But I have said nothing and written almost nothing. A man's relationship with God, I believe, is betwixt the man and his Maker. Mr. Madison, would you be kind enough, sir?
Indeed. Thank you, Your Excellency. I feel inclined to remind you of Mr. Doran's explanations and that of Mr. Fenn's, Mr. Fenn's reflections of where the exits are before I begin to speak, if this is the time you would now wish to leave. The account given by His Excellency is so fundamental to the education of a free people. The litany of events that transpired from our very earliest settling in this part of the world and to the point at which we are now living under an inactive constitution. The course of events are the most fundamental education for any child and the continued education of every adult. Without a knowledge of the chronology of events, all other philosophical questions, issues about divisions and separations between church and state, the idea of citizens being governed by themselves instead of being ruled by monarchs, concepts of the social compact written by John Locke, elements of republics written by Montesquieu and as far back as Plato in his Republic. There's several currents that transpire with our people, and I use that in the most collective sense. 1816, in the last year of my presidency, we added the 19th state of the Union of Indiana. Now there are some Aboriginal people. But the manner by which territories that we had in the country came to be a part of the United States, to actually be one of the states, is an interesting procedure. and all of those that join the Union as territories and all those that will join the Union have a fundamental obligations from their early childhood through their adulthood to know the story as it evolved and to penetrate in their education the intricacies of these matters so well reflected by His Excellency just a short while ago. When we see these course of events like a ball rolling down a hill and gathering in strength and size and momentum, it's almost irreversible. But when the course of mankind engages in actions and the pathos of the moment, the energies of the people, the resilience they may express, and the refusal to accept colonial endeavors by the king and by the parliament, these are issues of a broad stroke of a pencil or a brush. And in the course of all these events, after we deal with the chronology and have a better understanding of the chronology, there are other matters at foot and at play as well. In 1776, with the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the general assertion that each of the 13 separate colonies and countries that we were, General Washington described that perfectly well. The differences amongst the states were considerable. Their ties were to their own colonies. We learn in the course of our studies in school that there are 3 different kinds of colonies: a royal colony, a proprietorship, and those colonies, such as Connecticut, that were founded on commercial bases. And these differences in the way the colonies were formed, when they became colonies, Georgia as late as 1725, Massachusetts in 1600, 1609, Virginia and such. These early evolutions or emanations of British citizens coming to North America and settling here, with all the prejudices and with all the endowments that the European experience could offer them, they brought here to begin anew. Not to change too much, but to define and articulate who they were slightly differently than what they were in Europe. But there are broader events taking place. Many of you may recall the efforts of Newton when he starts speaking of the laws of gravity, of Copernicus, and contradicting the geocentric notion that the universe revolves around the Earth. It rather revolves around the sun. The notion that the world is not flat. In 1492, only 400 years before we were operating under the Constitution, when Franklin raises his kite and he has the lightning strike the kite, and the lightning fluid comes down the line to the key and into the Leyden jar. He's demonstrating that the curiosities we have in our own homes, I have one in my own home at Montpelier. It's a glass that turns on a crank with cloth attached to it, and as the cloth begins to gather the electric fluid, it extends to a brass bar. And when that brass bar gets overloaded with the electric fluid, a snap, a spark flies between the other bar and the other side of this contraption, and we see the spark for a moment. If we stand around the item, we hold hands, and someone turns the crank. Those of us who have hair find the hair rising up over the head until the people and the machine are so filled with electric fluid that a spark occurs and the hair falls down. It's an extraordinary experiment to witness in the parlor and to see lecturers traveling through Williamsburg and Philadelphia giving lectures on this electric fluid, and Franklin demonstrating that the lightning in the sky is very much similar to that spark in the parlor. When he does experiments with Spencer in France about the nature of iron bars going into the ground and extending over the houses and over the trees, that when there is a lightning storm, the lightning always goes to the rod. and it's repeated over and over again. We have Joseph Banks traveling to New South Wales with Captain Cook and making observations and ornithological observations about the birds and entomological observations about the insects. We have explorers writing new maps about the world in which we live, writing about the currents of the ocean. All the world that we knew and defined by Aristotle in 4 elements that lasted for 500 years are now beginning to be subjected to examination by philosophers and metaphysicists. We are brought up to believe in our homes from time to time that sometimes God was malevolent. And if you did something contrary to God's will, God would punish you by having that lightning strike your house. And there are certainly ample proofs for that happening from time to time, by circumstance or whatever, but people believed it. Until Franklin uses his kite and uses his rods out of the ground, until Newton starts speaking about the laws of gravity. And we come to learn and perceive the world in a different light than previous generations had viewed the world. And we also learn that kings retained their authority to rule. They became kings by divine right. And this is symbolized by the Pope, or the popes, taking the crown and crowning the king or crowning the queen. The king's right to rule is sanctioned by the church. It's recognizing the divine right of that man to rule a people. Well, this is presumably the natural course of events, but if everything else we're learning about the world becomes explicable, and we learn much about the nature of events, we begin to have a different perception about God's striking the house with lightning and the divine right of kings. We don't have to be ruled by kings. People can govern themselves. Very different to be governed than it is to be ruled. But man's perception of himself, our perception of ourselves, our role with one another, the autonomy General Washington refers to, of 150 years of these separate colonies being able to govern themselves and tax themselves and being involved in jurisprudential issues. They are defined very much in a small area, and many of these colonies had established churches. And the established churches, particularly in Virginia, the Anglican Church, certainly the commingling of the religion and of the civil authority. The church and the state were combined in English control of American colonies. Some were separate because of different reasons of how they were established as colonies. Maryland being very Catholic, and Pennsylvania perhaps having some Quakers there, and New England and Congregationalists.
Only apply to the national government. I sought to have them apply to the state governments, who I perceive to be a greater danger to the rights of individuals than the national government. For the very simple reason is that the national government is limited in its authority, and the state governments were plenary in their authority. Plenary only up to the point of issues that dealt with national issues, and the states suborned themselves to the national government in issues of national character that no one state or group of states could address. And in suborning themselves, they changed their sovereign nature, their sovereign status, and they became integral parts of the Union. By ratifying that Constitution, they no longer had their sovereign status. And as such, they were not free to leave the Union as some in New England sought to do in Hartford, just a short ways away from here. I bring these ideas to your minds. I know that many of you appear somewhat blank in expression and might indicate some inability to comprehend that which I've said. I I can assure you this is far more difficult for me to say than it is for you to understand. The nature of events are not only chronological, but they're broader strokes that occur. And in the effect of creating our revolution, and in establishing a new, united group of states of America, there were certain understandings that accrued in the nature of forming this new land, this new people, America, and that they're going to be governed rather than being ruled, and that they have certain perceptions of what the relationships are to each other, to their nature's God, and to the civil government themselves. And lastly, I run the risk of pursuing a matter which can be very embarrassing to my own friend. I say young because his relationship in this nation is going to grow with influence in the years to come. And all the vicissitudes of controversy and all the events that occurred, it could never have occurred unless amongst the citizenry there was an individual whose composure, his lack of ambition, his very character, steadfast, that whenever those of us engaged in controversies about this government were comfortable with one another, we could always turn to him as a leader. And I think if one looks at South America here and Nuevo Granada and the efforts of Bolivar and Mercedes and others in South America who try to rebel against Spain, they do not have the character amongst their people that has risen to the occasion as much as His Excellency General Washington. He and I have had many issues and disagreements with one another, to be sure. I invited to his home on several occasions for a week at a time. And he was very generous with his time, giving me the opportunity to reflect on matters during the convention and before and after the convention. But the one steadfast element is his character. And in no more single moment that I recognize it. We were gathered in Annapolis in December of 1783. His Excellency came, Mifflin from Pennsylvania was the governor of the United States Congress Assembly at that time. We gathered in the State House, windows large, rising, very tall, in the room, little gallery in which people gathered. The members of Congress were there to witness this event. And with all the dignity, not pomp and circumstance, with all the personal integrity and dignity that one would expect in such a character, His Excellency turned over his sword to the Congress and resigned his commission as commander of the armies. The army at that time was the only element in the nation that superseded all the states. The army was from all over 13 states. There were a few organizations, other than the Masons, perhaps, that might have reflected cross-state attachments. His Excellency was a symbol of that. And in that one act, turning over his sword, returning to Mount Vernon Christmas Eve, as he promised his wife, a nation was born to know that the civil government will not only be formed with all the attachments that people can have to their beliefs in God, but also that they do not have to fear, at least initially, the military takeover and rule by force and by chance. His motions at Annapolis on that occasion will always be registered in my mind to witness it. And it's symbolic of the character. It's symbolic of what our nation can look to in the future. We don't have the coronation of kings. We don't have the celebrations of nobles' birthdays. We don't even have the imprinting of a person's face upon our coin. There's a recommendation of Mr. Washington's face being imprinted on the coins. 1792 of the Coin Act. Sir, beneath the character of Mr. Washington to suggest himself to that British poet. And in consequence, the sign of liberty was cast on those first coins, instead of the image of the individual. I have labored too long, I've trespassed upon your goodwill too long. I think perhaps if there was any ambiguity in my statements, it may be perhaps rectified by any questions you might have. I appreciate Mr. Fenn being here tonight. And I also appreciate Reverend Mason for the generosity of sharing the church with us today. Mr. Monroe and I competed with one another in 1789 inside the Hebrew Church in what is now Madison County. The church would not let us debate with one another inside the church. March, it was cold outside, we had to stand on the steps. Frostbite in my nose, I still have mark. But it be as it goes here in Lexington. Far more generous for time and attention. And as we celebrate the Lord, I hope I can return to England and give some indication of what the Lexington in Massachusetts represents. At the same time, I can speak of Lexington in Virginia. Thank you.
Lofty sophisms, although feel free. And if you are reticent or afraid to ask the first question, we will accept the second question first. I'll repeat your question, so it's all right.
Would you distinguish judgment answer this question for me? You have spoken much of liberty and of individual rights. And how then do you square that with owning hundreds of human beings as slaves?
She is trying to understand how we can reconcile being owners of slaves as property when we speak of liberty and freedom. They cannot be reconciled with that. As I have written, slavery is an abomination. And it is an institution that we shall all be quit of. It is not only an abomination in the eyes of divine providence, but it is a failed economic model. I would suggest to you, madam, that sometimes change needs to happen in very small incremental steps. But I appreciate your question, although it lacks an understanding of the context of our time. So I might understand the context of your times. May I ask you, do you have slavery in your day?
Yes.
We still have a lot of work to do.
It may be said also that the nature of the society we've created in 1776, and perhaps even an element of security to it with the writing and passing of the Constitution, we have become a society that is so unique to society, other societies in the world, that one of the consequences of this is we open ourselves to considerable examination, not only by European courts, but examination amongst ourselves, pride of certain things we've done, certain institutions to extent. We no doubt will open ourselves to examination by subsequent generations of what it is we do. Perhaps being at the footstep of the door, which we would like to see the society in the way individuals can be free and independent rights, private rights, and other countries. Perhaps the first steps that we should have taken, and the steps we have taken, is to declare the principles unequivocally, and then seek to have ourselves and subsequent generations to fulfill those ideals expressed at the beginning. If we fail to express those ideals at the the very beginning. There'd be nothing for subsequent generations to achieve or to retain themselves in a state of harassment and conflict. So I don't think that necessarily I attribute this question not necessarily to your understanding of the time, but also attribute it to their youth and inexperience. But I believe that every generation may find in itself an institution or practices which are so abhorrent to the reflective mind, yet they are extant while the person is reflecting upon them. And it only shows that in a Republican form of government we have an opportunity to address these issues freely and consider it and moderately. Whereas in other institutions of government, the oppression and the objections would be suppressed, and it would never be brought before the public mind for examination at all. So I hope that the question is not one of censor to those of us who may appear contradictory in the views of yourself or subsequent generations, but rather perhaps to look those issues that we can address, I believe effectively addressed in the beginning, and that is the first door to be opened.
May we have another question, Trent? Or are you all cowed by this response? Sir? Nice and loud, please. I've been around too many candidates.
Thank you for coming. We're all familiar with the term unalienable rights, and as you spoke so eloquently, you have your examples at the time were kings and queens and rulers at the time. So I guess I'm asking, where did the spark of that idea come from? If you didn't have any examples to look at, to model after, and how do you then convey that example to the common person who only knew what it was like to live under the rule of the king?
Well, I will give you the short answer. I'm sure that Mr. Madison will follow up. If Mr. Jefferson were here, he would tell you without reservation that every word that he had written in the Declaration of American Independence, he being the primary author, it was a committee, but he was the primary writer of that. Every one of those words reflected an idea that already existed. So it was not as if we took original thought. The ideas have gone back as far as Aristotle and Cicero, Algernon Sidney, John Locke, as Mr. Madison so eloquently explained, these are the natural rights of man. All Jefferson did was to remove the lofty sophisms of much of the previous writing. You know, I hope this is not untrue. Mrs. Washington enjoyed a bit too much cherry rice. And she was speaking about a particular fellow, shall go unnamed. And she said of that fellow, he always says the most beautiful things. He just never does anything. America took the most beautiful ideas and we acted on them. And we continue to act on them to make them more perfect.
I concur.
You want to talk about a moment of history? I must tell you, you are not acquitting yourselves favorably. All the questions are coming from this side. Sir.
Since each of the colonies had a different religious tradition, how could it have been possible to have an actual state religion when you had Congregationalists in New England stand back and say, we can't deal with this, they'll leave it to the states, which they did.
Well, your point is taken precisely, and I think Mr. Madison is probably well suited to give you a better answer than myself, but I am put in mind, sir, of the Royal Colony of Virginia, in which as citizens of that colony, prior to our Declaration of American Independence, prior to the problems that we had, we all had to tithe to the Church of England. And if you were a Hebrew or a Catholic, you had to tithe. You had a choice if you chose not to tithe. Jail, but you had to tithe. And so it is your point exactly. This is what we, by the structure and the differences, we came together in a stronger aggregate.
What occurred in the convention in 1787, the events leading up to that, and the events during the ratification struggle, was the establishment of a national government with the same purposes as that of the national government under the Articles of Confederation. What we sought to do was not to change the scope of the national government, but rather to clearly define the structure of how that government would operate, so it would have the energy and the authority to do the same things that the Articles of Confederation were required to do, but did not have the energy and authority to accomplish. Required a change in the relationship of the states to each other and the states to the new form of national government. Immediately questions were being asked about the establishment or a Bill of Rights that would be imposed upon the government, that would be reflected in their Constitution. I thought it was unnecessary. Again, because the national government only had the authority to deal with national issues and all other issues with respective states. So there's no danger because there's no authority for the national government to intrude on the rights of individuals. Indeed, being a limited government, it would not have the plenary authority that the state governments would have on all of the domestic matters. So the threat to individual rights and liberties came from the states, not from this new federal government. It wasn't that the new federal government was going to try to establish religion. In fact, I didn't think that the national government had any inclinations to establish anything of a religious nature. But at the time that the convention took place in 1787, it's essentially 11 years after the Declaration of Independence. From 1776 to 1780, the 13 separate states each wrote their respective constitutions. Massachusetts was the last one to do so in 1780, and by the way, almost the entire hand of John Adams, which I don't think many people give proper credit for. The Massachusetts court asked the committee to prepare a constitution for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The committee asked Mr. Adams to do that. And Mr. Adams engaged then in writing a constitution for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In all those matters that he gave over to the national government. So a Bill of Rights wasn't necessary for the national government. It was necessary to be imposed upon the states. But in 1787, only 8 of the 13 states had anything like a Bill of Rights, either in their constitutions or in their statutes, or in amendments to their constitution, or amendments to their statutes. Only 8. In those 8 states, none were congruent about what rights they were declaring for their state. And it's ingenuous to believe during the ratification struggle that all these ratifications were in jeopardy because people demanded the national government to have a Bill of Rights, when the states themselves didn't have a Bill of Rights, when the states themselves were the threat to the people's rights, and the national government was not. So there's a course of events that take place here that require a very broad understanding of the events and the circumstances surrounding it. And I hope it doesn't get obfuscated in the course of generations to come, where they confuse some of these matters, and thus the storyline begins to take a different track than it actually had occurred. That's
When we realized that our guests spent the better part of 2 weeks getting here from Virginia. I think that we shouldn't impose on them. Perhaps a couple more questions. You have a question.
I have read that there's, and you have alluded to great differences in dissension among the delegates created in the Constitution. I wonder if you have some wisdom for us today, because our political culture is coming apart, in my opinion, at the seams, and we do not seem to have a way of coming together to create policy for difficult times, sort of like before the Civil War, you might say. So I just wondered if you had some...
In England?
No, sorry, our own Civil War, which came under slavery.
Well, if I may,
So you left that slavery issue unresolved, but it...
yes, we did. We shelved it for 18 odd days.
Yeah, and then we had to deal with it.
First of all, madam, if I may, I'm most pleased to learn that you can read. No, you need to understand, when the Declaration of American Independence was adopted, Mr. John Dunlap in Philadelphia City did 300 strikes of the Declaration, and they were passed out. Some were sent, for example, a copy was sent to himself. I was on the Long Island fighting the war already. But in Philadelphia City, they were handed out to people hither and yon. And it was very common, from what I understood, to see people in the street looking at this declaration and dropping it in the gun. And it wasn't because they didn't agree with it, it was because they could not read. So I applaud you. With your grace and understanding, perhaps this should be the last question of the night. And let me answer you by telling you a story about the last day of the Constitutional Convention. It was September 17th, 1787. We signed the Constitution on that day. I was the presiding officer in Philadelphia. Once that act was completed, I thanked all the delegates for their more than 1/3 of a year of service. And I released them all to return to their states and begin the ratification process. I was up on the dais now, and I was putting my own papers together. I wanted to get back home. And I heard a tap, and another tap, and another tap making its way to the dais. I looked over, and there was the sage of Philadelphia, Dr. Benjamin Franklin. And he was making his way to the dais, and I immediately stepped down off the dais, and I took his elbow in support. I said, Dr. Franklin, sir, how may I be of service? He was in agony. That was an agonizing walk. He had the gout in both feet. He had stones in his kidneys. There were days, you well remember, that he could not walk in to the Constitutional Convention. He was carried in on a sedan chair on the shoulders of 4 prisoners from the Walnut Street jail. Other days worse than that, carried in horizontally on a litter. And so I said to him, because that was quite a journey for him to make, how can I be of service, Doctor? He had a Crabtree walking stick. It was curious. It had a solid gold Liberty cap as its top. It was his most prized personal possession. And when he died, he left it to me. He had that stick. He started poking it past me. And I said, Doctor? He said, General, in our day, when a painter paints a sun on the horizon, or when a woodcarver carves a sun on the horizon, I had no idea. I told him, I don't know what you're referring to. He said, General, I've been looking at your chair throughout these proceedings. Now I knew what he was speaking about, for on the shoulder board of the chair that I had been sitting on throughout the Constitutional Convention, carved in it was a sun on the horizon, beautifully gilded. He said, you know, when artisans do that, General, you can never tell. I said, Doctor? He said, General, you can never tell if it is a rising sun or if it is a setting sun. And he went on. He said, throughout the great rancor of this process, the debates, the faction, the division, large states versus small states, wealthy states versus poor states, free states versus slave states, northern states versus southern states. I saw this union crumbling before it could even take form. But today, and I will own to the fact that Dr. Franklin had a tear in his one eye. He said, today, General, we have signed this Constitution. And I have the great happiness to know that it is a rising sun on America, and not a setting. Madam, I tell you this because that was the secret to our success in forming up this nation. And you may have problems in your day and your time. You need to know two things. We have always had problems, and the receipt, forgive me, I think we call it a recipe. We call it a receipt. The recipe for our success is exactly the same in your day. We as Americans can overcome absolutely any obstacle. We can defeat absolutely any adversary, as I have written and as you may read, as long as we set aside faction and set aside division, and as I have also written, dare I say, as long as we set aside political party, which does little but raise the interest of party above the common welfare, and typically the self-interest of a small number of unscrupulous men. The motto of the country apparently has changed. Mr. Madison and myself were fascinated to learn this. In your day, the motto is not the motto when the country was formed up. It's a lovely sentiment. The motto of the country in your day is in God we trust. It's lovely. That was not the motto, madam, when we formed up this nation. The Latin phrase, e pluribus unum. Out of many, one. That is the secret recipe. Mr. Madison and I thank you for your kindness and your generosity.